You hear artillery in the distance, a steady, hollow rumble that slides under the hiss of winter wind. Snow, blackened and scarred, crunches under marching boots. Soldiers move like a tide across a vast, frozen plain. At dawn that morning, millions of German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. Bombers tore the sky, cities burned in columns of smoke, and entire divisions were caught by surprise. For the Soviet Union, World War II did not begin in 1939. In Russia and across the former Soviet republics, this conflict is remembered as the Great Patriotic War. Tonight, you'll see how it started, how it almost destroyed a nation, and how it ended with Soviet soldiers raising flags in Berlin. Picture Eastern Europe in 1939. Europe is a simmering map of treaties and ambitions. When Germany marched into Poland in September, the world moved toward a new kind of war. But the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, did not immediately line up against Germany. Instead, you find the Soviet leadership signing a pact with Berlin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. On paper, it was a non-aggression treaty. Beneath the paper, in a sealed secret protocol, it carved Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. From Moscow's point of view, this deal bought time. Stalin believed the Soviet state needed breathing room, and he had reasons. The military had not fully recovered from purges that hollowed out experienced leadership. Industry was in the middle of a rapid, violent modernization, so the Soviet Union took what it could. Soviet forces moved into eastern Poland, into the Baltic states, and later clashed with Finland in the Winter War. Those moves were meant to secure borders and create strategic depth. In Kremlin strategy, time was a weapon. They wanted to buy it. Yet this strategy carried risk. Trusting a regime like Nazi Germany was always fragile. Hitler's ambitions were clear in his rhetoric and his generals' plans. Expand eastward, secure Lebensraum, crush ideologies that stood in his way. For a people who had just survived revolution, famine, and purges, this looming threat felt paradoxically distant and dangerously close. You can almost feel the tension, factories hammering out tanks, trainloads of civilians and equipment already moving toward the vastness beyond the Urals, and the quiet hope that a diplomatic paper could hold a hungry empire at bay. Then June 22nd arrives. Operation Barbarossa is unleashed, the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million Axis soldiers stream across a front stretching over 1,000 miles. From Moscow's perspective, this is no longer a question of politics or territory. Imagine the shock. The dawn sky filled with tracer and contrails. Rail lines cut, communications disrupted. Entire Soviet armies find themselves encircled before they can form cohesive defenses. Millions of soldiers are taken prisoner in the early weeks. Cities like Kiev and Smolensk fall in rapid succession. The Western Soviet border becomes a landscape of burning towns, abandoned artillery, and columns of refugees trudging deeper into the interior. For Soviet citizens, the invasion is a shattering betrayal. Nazi ideology views Slavic peoples as inferior. Hitler spoke openly of conquest, of seizing farmland, factories, the very living space of the East. To those in Moscow and in the villages, the invasion reveals an intent that is more than territorial. It is genocidal and total, and the Red Army pays a terrible price. Logistics collapse in places. Experienced officers are missing, either purged or executed in earlier years. Tank battles erupt, but coordination is lacking. Airfields are destroyed on the ground. It feels like watching a slow-motion unraveling, one catastrophic encirclement after another. By late 1941, the German army is at the outskirts of Moscow. The fear in the city is visceral. People who've never handled weapons are digging trenches. Factories aren't just producing tanks and rifles. They are being dismantled and put on trains, shipped east beyond the Urals, to continue production out of reach of the German advance. You see convoys of civilians, soldiers, and factory equipment trundling across a landscape that grows more forbidding by the day. Troops from Siberia are rushed to the front, tough, hardy soldiers acclimated to cold that will prove decisive. The winter bites cruelly. German supply lines, strained and overstretched, begin to suffer in the face of mud and frost. In December 1941, as if the weather itself had been enlisted, Soviet forces launch a counteroffensive near Moscow. It's not a polished, perfectly choreographed strike. It's desperate, raw, and sometimes chaotic. But it works. German forces, exhausted and ill-prepared for the brutal Russian winter, are pushed back. For the first time since June, the invaders are forced into retreat. The Soviet Union has survived the immediate blow. The war is no longer a quick catastrophe. It becomes a long, grinding test of endurance. By 1942, Hitler is still pressing eastward, this time toward the oil-rich Caucasus. The city of Stalingrad, a dense industrial city perched on the Volga, becomes the epicenter of a vicious and symbolic battle. The fighting there transcends military calculus. It takes on a symbolic weight. For Stalin and the Soviet leadership, letting the city that bore his name fall would be unthinkable. For Hitler, capturing it promises control over crucial transport and the morale boost of another major victory. Stalingrad turns into a grinding, hellish slog. The combat is intimate, street by street, building by building. Each room a potential tomb. You can imagine soldiers crawling through basements, stairwells filled with smoke, snipers picking off any head that peeks above rubble. Civilians get trapped in the crossfire, and whole neighborhoods are reduced to jagged shells. Then the Red Army executes a massive pincer movement. Soviet forces encircle the German Sixth Army, cutting off supplies and sealing their fate. The encirclement is an extraordinary feat of logistics and cold calculation. Starvation, cold, and relentless Soviet pressure forced the Germans into surrender. In February 1943, the Sixth Army capitulates. Stalingrad is not just a battlefield victory. From the Soviet perspective, it's the turning point that proves Germany can be defeated. The momentum shifts. The initiative begins to belong to Moscow. Summer 1943 brings another monumental clash, the Battle of Kursk. Germany attempts a final major offensive, Operation Citadel, designed to pinch off a large Soviet salient. Instead, it runs into a prepared and deeply layered defense. The Soviets have built trenches, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and multiple lines of resistance. The battlefield becomes a clogged, grinding machine of metal and mud. Kursk is the largest tank battle in history. You can almost hear the metallic scream of engines. Feel the ground shudder under the weight of thousands of tanks. Despite fierce German attacks, the Red Army holds. When the German assault falters, the Soviets launch their own offensives. From that moment, the Red Army is largely on the offensive for the rest of the war. The Soviet advance is relentless and costly. They push westward, liberating occupied territories across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Each step forward is marked by devastation. Cities lie in ruins, villages are wrecked, and lines of refugees wind through the countryside. The human cost is staggering, but the momentum is clear. The German army is shrinking, forced onto the strategic defensive as Soviet numerical depth and industrial capacity tell. As 1944 unfolds, Soviet forces cross into Eastern Europe. The Red Army moves like a tide, sweeping away German garrisons, leaving behind territories that will soon fall within the Soviet sphere of influence. 1945 brings the final grim push into Germany itself. The landscapes of Eastern Europe, once filled with partisan fighters, ruined towns, and scorched earth, now become staging grounds for the final drive. The Battle of Berlin is urban warfare at its most intense. Streets are lined with rubble. Buildings are turned into deadly strongpoints. Soviet troops, hardened by years of battle and personal loss, surround the city in April 1945. The assault is relentless. Tanks and infantry, sappers and artillery move through a maze of blockhouses and barricades. Inside a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler's world collapses. He dies in April, within weeks. German resistance fragments. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders. From the Soviet perspective, victory is complete but hollow in many ways. Cities are secured and banners raised, but the cost cannot be overstated. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million citizens, soldiers and civilians. in number that dwarfs the losses of every other nation in the conflict. Homes, infrastructure, entire ways of life are gone. Victory transforms the Soviet Union. It emerges from the war as a global superpower, its armies occupying Eastern Europe and shaping the post-war order. The map of the continent is redrawn. Eastern Europe falls within Soviet influence, creating a buffer of satellite states that will define geopolitics for decades. The struggle that began with invasion now turns into a new kind of dominance and a looming rivalry with the West. But the war's legacy is more than geopolitics. It becomes a central pillar of Soviet identity. The Great Patriotic War is commemorated annually, with solemn parades and ceremonies. Monuments are erected, names carved on walls. For generations, the narrative of sacrifice and victory becomes woven into schooling, into songs, into the way families remember lost relatives. Yet the societal scars remain raw. Cities like Stalingrad, later rebuilt and renamed Volgograd, had to rise from rubble. Entire villages and towns were wiped off the map. Millions of families grieved fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who never returned. Economies were drained. Industry took years to rebuild. The psychological toll was vast. Survivors carried the weight of what they had seen and done. The war also shaped the Soviet state internally. Having demonstrated the ability to mobilize whole society, the Soviet government tightened its grip on Eastern Europe and recalibrated its internal rhetoric. The elements that had compensated for the earlier purges, centralized control, massive industrial mobilization, and a narrative of existential threat, became tools in building post-war authority. That authority would help transform the USSR into one of two main poles of power in the emerging Cold War. If you step back and look at World War II through the Soviet lens, some things stand out. The sheer scale of the Eastern Front, the degree of suffering, and the total mobilization of a nation. Western narratives sometimes center on D-Day, on the air war, or on the Pacific conflicts. But the Eastern Front was the largest and deadliest theater of the war. From 1941 to 1945, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of Nazi Germany's military might. This is a story of enormous human loss, yes, but also of resilience that reshaped the world. The Soviet experience of World War II is both a national trauma and a founding myth. As you close this account, remember the individual human faces beneath the statistics. The farmer turned soldier, the factory worker who rode a train east with nothing but a crate of tools, the nurse who dug out the wounded from ruins, the mother who waited in vain for a son who would never return. Their stories, repeated millions of times, are what give the historical sweep its weight. The Great Patriotic War is a study in extremes, unimaginable loss, and unyielding endurance. It changed borders, governments, and lives. It reminds you how quickly peace can give way to total war, and how a nation, against brutal odds, can fight not just for territory, but for the right to continue existing.